I think we should get going. Can we close the doors? Hopefully, we will be a bit too early for the noisiest of the protesters, but we may, seriously, we may get some shouting and screaming from outside as the event goes on. So we'll just have to raise our voices. Anyway, welcome everybody. My name is David Goodhart. I'm head of the demography unit here at Policy Exchange, and we are looking at the issue of age, and will age be the key electoral dividing line at the next election? Or perhaps we should say, will it be the key dividing line as it was at the last election? As most of you know, if only graduates had voted at the last election, Jeremy Corbyn would have been Prime Minister in 2019. So we know about the big cultural divides across the generations. I mean, everybody pretty much under 45 is liberal, if not hyper-liberal in their views, as Eric Kaufman over there will be telling us, I think, at another event later today. Of course, we've also had the arguments about economic divides, I guess the triple lock, and we could add to that now the elderly care cap on the side of the elderly economic advantage versus particularly falling home ownership amongst the 25-34 age group. Home ownership, I think, as recently as the 1990s was about 50% in that group. It's now down to less than 30%. But these things are obviously much more complicated too. There are all sorts of subdivides within generations, obviously. There was a piece, I don't know if any of you read the Saturday Times, there was a big piece by James Marriott on how there's never been a greater sort of living divide between older people and younger people. But it is one of those things, it's one of those huge generalizations which, as you're kind of reading the piece, you're thinking of all the reasons why exactly the opposite generalization might also be true. And I think it's true to say that it is said about the COVID lockdowns, never have young people sacrificed so much for older people. And indeed, partly because of the housing, the difficulty of getting on the housing ladder, never have young people gone on living for so long with their parents, something that brings generations together. Never, arguably, have grandparents spent so much time looking after grandchildren. So it's not quite as simple as that. And we may also be returning to, perhaps have already returned to a period in which economics is becoming more important than culture, which, again, can both reduce and exacerbate perhaps the divide across the generations. Anyway, why don't we hear from our panelists? On my left is Neil O'Brien, who is an ex-director of Policy Exchange, and now that rather rare thing, a minister who is not Liz Truss, or was not a Liz Truss supporter in the leadership election. He's now Minister for Social Care, and we will touch on that. We're not going to talk only about social care, and he's only very, very fresh in office, so we'll not be speaking in great detail about that, but we'll talk for a few minutes and then respond to questions from the rest of our panel and from you. And on the rest of the panel, we have on the far right, Caroline Abrahams, who's Director of Age UK, and next to me is Kelly Beaver, who is Head of Ipsos UK and Ireland, or the Chief Exec of Ipsos UK and Ireland. So I'm going to ask Neil to kick off with a few comments, and then Kelly, and then Caroline. So over to you, Neil.
Oh, well, thank you, David. And I should start with an apology insofar as I might be the Minister for Social Care, but I'm slightly in need of social care this morning. I'm feeling sick as a parrot, and not even from drink, ladies and gentlemen. But I couldn't miss an opportunity to be back at Policy Exchange, a think tank that's doing such brilliant work, and to be with David, one of the UK's most important thinkers, and with Age UK, who are people who do such good work in my own constituency, and also important policy work too. So hard to stay away, even despite everything. So age is obviously already has become the dividing line in British politics, as David said. If you look at the gap between the Conservative lead over Labour among older people over 65s and the Conservative lead over Labour, or deficit, among the under 25s, the difference between the old and the young was about 10 to 20 points between 1979 and 2015. Pretty stable. It's always been the case that younger people more likely to vote for left-wing parties, but in 2015, suddenly that gap started to balloon, and it went from being 10 to 20 points to being 40 points in 2015, then 70 points, around 70 points in 2017 and 19. And although we did better among both young people and old people in 2019, that gap didn't get any bigger. There's been this parting of the ways between the political views of old and young people. And when you are a jobbing MP and you go and knock on doors, it's very apparent. Someone opens the door and you can immediately give yourself some sort of probability that they're likely to vote for you, which is a rather sad state of affairs. Now, I'm going to touch briefly on kind of young people, but then talk a bit about older people as well, which is more in my current role. Though it's worth saying that adult social care, which is what I look at, slightly more than half of the budget actually goes on people who are aged 18 to 65, and that actually has grown faster because more people with disabilities and serious health conditions are living longer, thankfully. That actually has grown just as fast, if not faster, than the cost of social care for people over 65. So young people, clearly there is a lot for us to do there. If I'm allowed to mention another think tank I've been involved in, Onward did a piece of work called Generation Why after the 2017 election, and we looked at all the different reasons why younger people seem to be more likely to vote for left-wing parties, and we did a decomposition analysis on the different theories that people had for that, and we found that it was, I'm afraid, a bit of everything. It was a combination of slightly more socially liberal, somewhat more economically left-wing. There is a demographic change, there's much more BME representation among younger people, and also materially worse off young people, much less likely to own their own home, to have done various things that make people more likely to vote Conservative. So a huge challenge for us, and lots that we have to address there. I mean, just to pick on one thing on housing, I've been writing a whole series of papers on the challenges facing Liz Truss over the summer of a Conservative home, if you want to see more detail. But clearly on housing, we do need to increase supply and do that in ways that are politically deliverable. That's absolutely the not sufficient, but certainly necessary condition of us getting anywhere among younger people. But let me turn on to kind of adult social care. And I'm not really in a position, as someone who's been in the job for 2 weeks, to give you some barnstorming speech or come here and tell you I've got all the answers. That would be obviously ludicrous. But I do want to ask some questions, because we do have people that do know about this on the panel. And the questions that are on my mind include these. So firstly, we have to deliver the major charging reform that David mentioned. And it's not just a cap on the total amount that people will pay towards their social care, but also a much more generous means test. Many people, I'm sad to say, get to the point where they need social care, often in a sudden way because of an accident, and they believe that there's a national care service, and they discover that in fact we have a safety net service. And we, through the charging reform, will mean that fewer people are completely lose all of their assets because of misfortune and luck. But also the more generous means test will help a much wider group of people. We'll go from a situation where you don't get any help from the state unless you've got assets worth less than 24,000 to one where you get help if you've got assets worth less than 100,000. So substantially more generous means test, and a lot more people getting help with the cost of social care. So that's a huge program, a huge IT challenge. We've got to deliver it right. There's a lot of challenges on the way to delivering that major and very welcome reform. But there's also deeper questions about social care that are on my mind. One is about how we improve quality. So one of the things that a lot of people talked about is the idea of a named carer. A lot of people getting domiciliary care, see a lot of different people coming through their house. If you're old, if you're confused, that is often not what you want. You want a named person, like an old-fashioned GP, to come again and again. And there's lots of reasons why that problem has happened. A lot of bureaucracy about how people's care is managed, and the pinging-ponging between the NHS and local authorities is part of that. There are models that a lot of people are interested in the Netherlands, an organisation called Buurtzorg, which was set up by a group of nurses, disaffected nurses, who are fed up of the bureaucracy in social care, and have a system where not only does everyone have a named carer, but they are all nurses and they make decisions about who gets what care themselves. You don't have to go back to some bureaucratic decision maker. They just make those decisions on the ground. And that seems to work remarkably well. So that's one sort of thing. Quality and consistency is one thing I'm thinking about. Obviously, one of the biggest things on my mind is about how we speed up discharges from hospitals. Clearly, problems of discharging people who are recovering from hospital to social care are part of the story about delayed discharges that we have to fix urgently. How do we make sure that people quickly get the right re-enablement services, that they don't get parked in a care home and not re-enabled when they could be back on their feet? How do we make that conversation between the local authority and the NHS happen more quickly and more effectively? And as part of that, that's part of a wider question that you'll all know about, which is about the integration of health and social care. I work for the Department of Health and Social Care, a relatively recent name change. Over the last 10 years, we've been working towards that integration. We set up 8 or so years ago the Better Care Fund to try and join up the spending of those two sides of the system. But there's still a long way to go. And I'm interested in what milestones we should use, what markers and measures we should use of whether integration is successfully happening. For example, in the county where I'm an MP, we have Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, and 2 of those have their local authority decision makers and their NHS decision makers in the same room, which I think speeds up things radically, but then one of them we don't. And so that tells you about the patchy nature of integration going on in the NHS today. Another question on my mind is about how we more effectively use civil society, the big society, whatever you want to call it. Clearly, if you were to try and put an economic value on the amount of care that is provided by the state, the private sector, and the informal, unpaid sector, the informal and unpaid sector, as usual, would dwarf what we spend as a government of that. You know, love and care that family members provide for older relatives, that neighbours provide for neighbours, and so on and so forth. How can we do more to harness the power, the incredible power of civic society? 1 million people volunteered during COVID to help. And that shows you something about the extent of the desire to help. And in social care, perhaps more than anywhere else, there is a potential for people to just go and check in on older neighbours to make sure they're not lonely, to build on some of the things that the government has been doing through its loneliness strategy. And last but not least, I think there is it's quite a sort of profound question which goes a bit beyond my brief, which is about how we die, really. And I thought about this the other day because I was talking to someone in intensive care, an ED, and she was talking about an older gentleman who he's 102, and he was blue lighted across town, no pulse when he arrived. And this amazing nurse, who's a Kiwi and incredibly plain-spoken, just said, they were like, what can you do? And she was like, he's dead. And she made the point very forcefully to me that the British way of dying is actually quite unusual internationally. New Zealand is much more normal for people to die at home, surrounded by loved ones, rather than in hospitals, surrounded by machines. And this goes to quite a lot. One pause, all right? Never talk about sensitive subjects when you've got a full stomach.
Take a gulp.
It goes to I have property. That's what should I say? It goes to some really big questions, because if you think about the Queen, she died with many members of her family in the place that she'd always said she wanted to die, and I think a lot of people would like to have more control. And they don't want their deaths to be so heavily medicalised at huge expense and for us to flog the dead horse. But it's difficult to have those conversations with the loved ones, isn't it? It's difficult to make those plans. And how we change our attitude to some of those things.
Do you have any idea how
really
how many people do die in hospices? I mean, is it a tiny number?
It's not a tiny number. It's a huge World and Age UK. I'm sure we'll have numbers for it.
very few older people die in hospices. It's generally people in midlife with cancer.
Yeah.
Older people tend to die either at home or much more commonly in hospital.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm sorry to slightly choke up while talking about this because it is, it's a profound question, and there's lots of technocratic and technical questions in the ones I have to answer, but there's also some really big, profound questions about in an ageing society with huge pressures on social care and the too small resource we have for the love and care of older people. How do we make sure that people get what they really want, and at the same time that we use the resources that we've got effectively? And I don't need to be told that the system is strained, and 80% of the people who work in social care in the private sector, which is most of the market, get paid within £1 of the minimum wage. And this goes to some points that David has been writing about head, hand, and heart, about who we value and how we reward and give esteem to those who do those jobs of hand and heart. And so I think that while there are some urgent questions that I need to get right about charging reform, and there's some big things we have to do in the very near future to try and sort out the gumming up of hospitals from social care, there are also some really big, profound questions. And I'm hoping anyway that some of the brilliant experts in this room can help me answer them. And I'm really here to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks. That's a really useful start, and we'll come back to some of those questions, not least on social care itself. But Kelly, over to you, and then Caroline.
Thanks very much. So I thought I would just, in my 3 minutes, give you 4 key points about the differences in voters for different age groups, just to help set the context, perhaps what Caroline might cover in a moment. The first key point is really that age is the preeminent divide politically for voters at the minute, but it is not the only key distinctive point. And actually, whilst it's accelerated as a dividing line over the last decade, and yes, it's the highest, as Neil said, since 1979, actually what we see is that other factors beneath the surface tell us that each age group is not, they're not a homogeneous group. And you do need to look at tenure, at education, and also gender as some of the subgroups to truly understand what matters to different parts of the age spectrum. Additionally, I think the key point on that one is that even with the age issue and it not being the same, there are now, if you look at the data from this year, class is starting to rise its head again, and we see it coming up particularly in how voters feel about Liz Truss. So when we ask about how they feel, whether she's doing a good job or a bad job, class is more dominant as a factor actually than age. It's the first time we've seen that for a while on the Prime Minister. So my second key point is that from the data from the last election, and then if we look for the last, since January of this year, age isn't, there are no signs yet that age itself as a factor has declined across the board. And when we look at people's voting intentions by Conservative and Labour, that pattern is quite similar as it was. And despite that contentious youth quake that we saw in 2017, actually, we still see that the younger voters are less likely to come out and vote than those in the older categories. The third key point is about the differences, and this is one that comes across quite starkly in what people care about and also what their values are like, depending on age. And there are big differences between those in the younger age categories and those in the older age categories. Particularly for the young, the things that they're most concerned about are cost of living, the economy, housing and rents, mental health well-being, wages and poverty and inequality. They're more concerned than older groups about those particular categories. And when you look at what they care about locally, there are even bigger distinctive differences. For the young people, what they want in their local area, better wages. For the over 55s, crime and antisocial behaviour is something they want tackled as a top priority, and so on. And there are real big differences there from what people want on levelling up and their local areas. And there are differences as well as how each group feels about spending. And this is important at the minute, as we've seen some of the most recent economic policies from government. Young are more concerned about high taxes, perhaps because they perceive themselves as not benefiting as much from public spending. And there are big differences, and Neil touched on these in people's views. young people tend to be more liberal, and this is and older categories traditionally more traditional by their older age groups as well. So the last point is around the future. And when you look at the overall ageing population, it's clear that there will be political weight of older people in future. So it is a really important dividing line for the Conservative Party to consider as they go into what is likely to be a 2024 election. There are already more over 65s than there are under 15s, and the ranks of the older generations are likely to swell further in future. There's also bigger differences in the younger groups coming forward than there have been historically. If you look at some of the recent DFE data on schools, 1 in 3 young people in primary schools in England today are from ethnic minority backgrounds. That's quite a transition, and that's the kind of differences that are coming up and through and will eventually be voters in the country. So it does raise some questions about what kind of correct policies are there that help to address the needs of the young, or the perceived needs of the young, the perceived needs of the old, but actually the category in the middle, which is the real battleground, that middle tier of ages where it is still very much all to play for, and you can see that coming through when you look at the voting attention. That could actually be the key political political battleground of the next election. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Caroline, over to you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much for coming today, everybody. It's lovely to see you, and it's very nice for us at Age UK to be here with Policy Exchange. And congratulations again to the ailing Neil on his appointment. And if that's where you are after 2 weeks, I think we're in good hands. Really look forward to working with you. I'm not going to try and answer the question, which is a very difficult question, not least because we could be 2 years away from an election, as everybody knows. And as we also know, a week is a long time in politics, as lots could change, and does change absolutely all the time. But what I will do is just tell you a little bit about what older people tell us matters to them. And we will, of course, continue to track that over the next 2 years, and we will offer what we find on a completely open and even-handed basis to all the political parties. And I hope you and others will find that useful. So we asked, we reached out to older people with whom we're in contact over the summer while the leadership contest was going on, and we asked what would be your top priorities for the incoming Prime Minister, whoever that happened to be. And older people told us very clearly that they thought the triple lock was the most important thing to them, coupled with help with the cost of living. And then there was a little gap, and then it was around health and social care. And what was interesting about that for us was that normally when we ask that sort of question, it's the other way around. Usually health and social care are at the top for older people, and cost of living is further down the list. So I think that echoes something that David said at the beginning of this meeting. Actually, older people are really worried, just as people are right across our society, I think, about prices, about how they're going to get through the winter. So obviously we were absolutely thrilled to hear the Prime Minister confirm yesterday with Laura Kuenssberg that she will be abiding by the triple lock. That is an enormous relief. But we have to remember that that doesn't come into play until April next year. And the problem for lots of older people is how they get from where we are now, just at the beginning of October, with the new price rises for gas and electricity having come in, and April. That's a 6-month period where quite a lot of older people are scratching their heads and wondering how they're going to come through. And we know from analysis that we've done of official statistics that even after the government's huge package to try and support households, there will still be 1.3 million older people who are in fuel poverty and living on a low income. That's 1.3 million older people who, as far as we can see, are going to find it extremely difficult to be able to pay all their bills. So I think that's a remaining challenge, and it is something for all the political parties to think about. Basically, what I'm saying is the government's done a lot, but arguably it hasn't done enough to help those at the bottom. And I think that's something that, you know, if I was working for a different sort of charity that was with, say, working age people, would be saying exactly the same. And therefore, decisions that are made in a few weeks' time about whether to uprate benefits or not matter just as much to older people as they do to younger ones. And that's because the poorest older people receive something, we hope, when they claim it, called pension credit. And that isn't tied to the triple lock. It's what takes a poor older person above the line, whether they're within poverty or above it. There's a big problem with it, which is lots of older people don't claim it, however hard we try to persuade them. Lots of people don't know about it. But essentially, if a decision is made in a few weeks' time not to raise the level of benefits in line with inflation, our 1.3 million older people who are going to be struggling are going to be in for a very hard time. A big thing for you to think about and for us to think about too. So just turning to health and care for a minute, when we talk to older people about health, the things they talk to us about back very much reflect the ABCD, which the Secretary of State has just announced are her priorities. Particularly, can I see a GP? Can I access primary care? That's tremendously important to older people. And of course, GPs matter hugely to older people trying to stay fit and well and independent at home. Also, those long waiting lists. I think about 1 in 3 of all the people who are on those 7 million elective waiting lists are older people, and they're typically waiting for, some of them waiting for diagnostics, lots are waiting for cataracts, knees, hips, those sorts of things. Not fun if you're trying to live your life and you're coping with those sorts of impairments, and very concerning for older people. And also, of course, if I have a fall, if something happens at home, if we need to ring an ambulance, will it actually come? Those are things really, really important in terms of giving people confidence. And you get older, it's quite a scary thing getting older sometimes. You feel some of your capacity isn't quite what it was. You're not as indestructible as you felt when maybe you were 30. So knowing there's something there, there's a safety net, is really important. And if people start to lose confidence in that, as I think they are really, because of what they see and read in the papers and so forth, that's a serious concern. And finally, social care. Neil's mentioned a number of the things that older people talk to us about. They particularly worry about, will the care come? Well, firstly, can I get it at all? That's an issue for lots of people, and Neil will know all about that, I'm afraid. But secondly, if I do get care, although the people are often very nice, there aren't, will they actually come? They don't come when they say they will. I'm not getting enough care. So it is exactly those issues of quality and consistency, which Neil's mentioned, that people worry about. And then finally, on the cap, the government has chosen to frame that around, do I have to sell my house do I have to sell my house to pay for care? And that's a bit of a problem, as I think has already become clear over the last few weeks. In fact, as Neil says, that most of the help that people will get is through a more generous means test. Very few people will reach the cap. You've got to have £86,000 of cash to spend on your care before you reach the cap. Most older people have nowhere near that amount of money. So I'm not sure how much political capital the government's going to get for the cap later on. I'm sorry to say that if that's depressing to this audience. The things that really matter, I think, to older people the most are the quality, consistency, the day-to-day bread and butter issues, and that's probably what you'd expect. Thank you.
Thanks. But just on that last point, Caroline, I mean, aren't your housing assets taken into account so that, if your costs do go on rising into the hundreds of thousands, you don't have to sell your house? I mean,
actually, as constructed, you could still very well have to sell your house under this cap. You won't have to sell it during your lifetime, but you've always been able to not sell it during your lifetime because of the existence of something called a deferred payment. So the cap isn't quite what people think it is. It's more a subsidy than an absolute cap. And the reason for that is because it doesn't pay all your care costs. It doesn't pay the cost of your board and lodging if you're in a care home. That's a lot of money, actually, as you can imagine. It's a bit like staying in a hotel. And there's also some fine print around how the cap is calculated, which takes into account the amount of assets. So actually, lots of people will still have to, I'm afraid, sell their home because the cap is set at a very high level.
Right. Well, let's come back to social care in a minute or two. And I mean, given the title of the event, I mean, let's just dwell for a little bit longer on the political divide. I mean, basically, younger people overwhelmingly to the left and older people overwhelmingly to the right, and perhaps how permanent that is likely to be. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is how different this is in different countries. I mean, national populism is often a very youthful movement. Meloni has just been elected, I think, often, partly on the votes of younger people. Marine Le Pen is very popular amongst younger people in France. And here I think there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that while younger people are sort of socially and culturally to the left, economically they're actually quite conservative. That they tend to be in favour of kind of low tax. They're quite entrepreneurial. They're anti-big state. I think there's perhaps conflicting evidence on this, but so the idea that they're sort of permanently in the kind of Labour camp is probably not the case. And actually, in your point about what 1/3 of all school children come from ethnic minority backgrounds, and while that means they're likely, obviously, to be liberal, or they're likely to be very much in favour of race equality, they're also very much more likely to be religious. They're very much more likely to, as a result of that, to be quite socially conservative. So actually, as that cohort starts to sort of move through the system, there might actually be, in 20 years' time, we might be having a meeting in which it's flipped.
We could be. And one of the things that we are hypothesizing but don't know yet, and we need to track over time, is whether, because some things do change as people move through the generations, your perspective on life and benefits and taxes, we do see some of these things shift as the generational cohorts move through. And we don't yet know, because that distinctive young group is going to be quite different than those that have went before. And seeing whether or not some of their leanings, their value systems, etc., start to shift a little bit will be something definitely worth watching. I think there are real differences in how young people today perceive the tax system comparatively to their older counterparts. The older counterparts would be happy to and keen to support improvements in NHS, social care, etc., but they want that money taken from income tax, and they want that money taken from working tax burdens, as opposed to young people who actually want money taken from other things in order to be able to substitute and pay for it. So there are quite differences in outlook, and we'll see how that moves through the generations.
I mean, just on the point of the triple lock. Is the triple lock, do you think, really going to be tenable? I mean, if we are seeing serious pressure now on public spending, and benefits generally being cut or being linked to wages, not inflation. I mean, can the triple lock survive?
I think it can. We promised it the last election. We've recommitted to it now. I think sometimes there's this sort of view in some of the commentary out there. Rich old people are so rich, they've got it so good, they've all got houses. But it's not right. And there's also a whole bunch of things that we did over the last 10 years, like the increase in the starting rate of income tax, which didn't have benefit for older people because they previously had a different starting rate anyway. So a lot of that resource that we put towards that is not something that older people saw. They're also facing a high inflation environment at the moment on a fixed income, which is obviously very worrying for a lot of them. So I think I get where that's coming from. I would just have a bit of a corrective to the occasion. There's a bit of a view in the commentary. Old people, they get it all. They have it so good, and I don't think that's true.
Well, guess what? I agree. Yeah, and you have to remember that even once the triple lock comes in, assuming it does, the state pension will still only be about 10,000 a year, a bit less than that, I think. And for the majority of the older population, the state pension is still the bulk of their retirement income. So, even on my dodgy maths, that tells me that most older people are living on less than 20,000 a year. That's not very much in our society. It's tough trying to exist on that. So, yes, of course there are older people who've done jolly well and who've got, good pensions, sitting in nice houses. But, yeah, it's a bit of a myth that that's everyone. I'm afraid there's, as I explained earlier, 1.3 million older people in fuel poverty and on a low income this winter. Those are the people we really worry about.
Let me open up to the floor in a moment, but I'd just like to kind of come back to some of these social care issues that Neil touched on. I think it's a very interesting point you make about the importance of having, as it were, a kind of primary carer at kind of both ends of the life cycle. It's sort of back to John Bowlby and attachment theory. We know about that for people, babies, but also at the end of a life, having having the same person appearing every day. Obviously, you're likely to get that in a care home, but not so much with domiciliary care. Is that something that's sort of feasible to to introduce?
I don't know whether it's feasible or not. It's certainly something I'm extremely interested in, and seeing whether that is something that we can do.
Right. Essentially, the current plans are mainly about money, and it's mainly about shifting some of the spending on social care from the individual to the state. There isn't very much new money in the current care reform plans. So, I think there's 500 million for looking at how to raise the status and, if possible, to some extent, the pay of the social care workforce. But there's been a lot of talk about, as it were, non-financial improvements. I mean, better career progression. The care certificate didn't work in the form that it was introduced, but perhaps a new version of that. Is that? Tell us a little bit about your thinking in
No, I
that.
think it's at a very nascent stage on all those things.
Right.
I think those are all important things to look at. We've made certain commitments in the white paper on care last year to try and improve the professionalisation of the workforce and have a better career structure to make it more attractive to work in care. I would say, actually, there's about 5 billion plus going into social care. That was announced last year. A lot of that is for the charging reform and increased generosity and more people getting care. So I would, a bit of a corrective to the idea, there's no new money, there's quite a lot of new money going in there. But of course, it's a system where, we're an ageing society and demand is going up.
Yeah, sorry, when I said new money, I meant, as it were, it's going to help
more people rather than
the workforce, as it were. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on what one can do to raise the sort of the status of care work without just paying people more. Obviously that is one of the important things.
Before I answer that, can I just say too, I'm really encouraged by what Neil said and all the statements he made at the beginning, because he's clocked something which isn't very widely clocked within social care at the moment, which is that social care is a very broad term. It helps loads and loads of different people in lots of different ways. Working age disabled people, people who are chronically sick in midlife, and older people. And at the moment, we try and have the debate as though it's all the same thing for everybody, and it really, really isn't. And for older people, most older people need social care towards the end of their life. They're probably in the last few years of their life. They have multiple health conditions. That's really why they need social care. Those are getting in the way of them being able to live their lives. So actually, a lot of the answer for older people is about getting it right between health and care. And not just in theory, but very much in practice, so that an older person in their home, is getting, say, the Birdsong model, which you referenced, which is basically just a way of joining up health and care locally in the community. It's what most older people need. And in some ways, some of the answers around social care are coming out of the NHS. A big move towards virtual wards, you might have heard of those if you're in the business at all, or anticipatory care. Lots of ideas about trying to get more health workers working with social care in the community to support older people to stay fit and well at home, therefore meaning they're less likely to need to go into hospital, therefore making it easier to support patient flow. So actually all these things join up, and part of this too is about making sure there are enough people in the community in health and in care so that older people are properly supported at the end of their life. They die at home. It's usually where most older people want to be, but often can't because there aren't the resources. So, as I say, for older people, you can't just look at social care on its own. It has to be in combination with health, just as you said. And in a way, that tells us something about the staffing issues too. Big problem for staff around social care is you can actually get as much money for doing the same job effectively in the NHS. There's a big gap. And so if you've got half a brain in social care and you want to be a social carer, why would you stay there working for a company as a dom carer when you could go and work in the hospital as a healthcare assistant and earn much more for the same? We're not going to solve that issue quickly, but again, part of the integration agenda has to, I think, be about joining those things up. And if more people were working together in multidisciplinary teams, it's inevitable that's where we're going to have to shift. But, the fact that all the things you said, Neil, suggests to me you understand some of that, and that's brilliant. And it's really, really refreshing.
So I just add one thing. So I've been watching this new show called This England. I don't know if any of you have watched it as well. I'm sure you have because of the nature of people in this room. It's absolutely brilliant. And apart from Boris Johnson's weird dreams, which I just cannot believe, the bit that struck me the most is the work that the social care sector picked up during that time. I find myself quite emotional watching it. And they're actually people who work in nursing professions. It doesn't specify whether those are nursing professions within the sort of the doctor nursing or within social care settings are the most trusted profession in Britain. And when you think about that, actually, making that sector and industry a more attractive industry for people to work within, first of all, don't let people watch This England, because that won't help, I think. But actually, doing something to enable a bit of a communication campaign, a bit of a voice for the sector about the impact that it had at a key critical time for the nation, because currently our older people are much more worried and much less optimistic about the state of the NHS and social care than their other age counterparts. It's a big, big problem to tackle. But the professions that work within it are actually incredibly trusted by the British populace.
And actually, one of the things about care, elderly care, particularly in elderly care homes, is that people, or at least a certain kind of person, actually really likes doing the job. It's like the NHS was 50 years ago, because there's continuity of care, whereas most hospitals are obviously, highly technical. You're in and out after a day and a half, and the sort of traditional nursing type care doesn't really have the opportunity to express itself. Anyway, we've got another 20 minutes or so. Let's have 2 or 3 questions. Lady over there, the back, and fellow next to her.
Hi, it's Joan Concannon.
Just say who you are, by the way.
Yeah.
Yep.
Joan Concannon from the University of York. I'm not sure whether this is Kelly or Neil or possibly both of you. For people who are going to retire in the next 10, 15 years, they've all worked in highly technology-driven work roles. What do you see as the role for digital health going forward to ease the burden? Because I get where you're coming from around having a named doctor and a named carer, but probably from a manpower perspective, that's not necessarily going to be as feasible. Is there the opportunity to do more in digital health to create those opportunities? And in that context, thinking about digital literacy and digital poverty and how we can address some of those issues by introducing more technology.
Take 2 or 3 more.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I don't know if it's...
Yeah,
here we go. James Dixon from West Ham. So I think one of the things here is an incentives problem. I don't actually think that older people want young people to struggle when it comes to housing, when it comes to pushing everything onto national insurance over income tax, etc. And I think the problem with the incentives is essentially the huge demographic bulge means that there is always the incentive for the voters and the politicians to interact in an unhealthy way, always focusing on the majority of the next election, and that effectively means you always get that big Conservative vote from the elderly, and it's no wonder young people don't vote for us as a result when we are on every single measure not helping. So how can we change those incentives so that we actually result in better policy outcomes that everybody agrees with?
Okay, a couple more over the side. Lady in blue and then the guy at the back.
Hi, I'm Emily Bird from MHA. We're the UK's largest charity care provider for older people. Really encouraged to hear what everybody's saying about the importance of care and of community-based services for older people. And I guess just wanted to sort of raise the issue of the extraordinary operating costs that charities and other organisations are facing, alongside plenty of other businesses, but the potential impact of that on the valuable services we've been talking about this morning. So, as we look towards the next financial year, there will be organisations thinking now about the services that we start to cut back on. What can we do, and what can perhaps the Minister help us to do to influence what the business department is looking at in terms of support for vulnerable industries, and how losing some of those services could really impact on making people vulnerable as well?
Actually, well, why don't you have quick replies? Actually, just hold it. We'll have one more round.
Yeah. So on technology, huge potential for that to help with our ageing society, to help more people stay at home for longer as they want, to use voice assistants, to shut the curtains, to do things for them. But also really things that I wouldn't call technology, but basic things like the design of care homes to make them trip-free and just to make them more navigable. A lot are just old houses that someone happens to have owned and then turned into a care home, and trying to modernise the approach and the use of technology. Things like sleep monitoring and so on. In the test of those things, they have huge impacts in terms of falls and things like that. On young people, it's a good point. There is lots more to do on younger people as well. I think one thing, there's no easy wins here, but one thing I think we should look again at is what we've done on universities, where if you look at the data from the longitudinal educational outcomes database, something like 30% of people, it's not worth it for them or the taxpayer for them to have gone and done the university course that they have done, and at the same time you've got the average level 4 apprentice earning more than the average graduate 5 years after they graduate, which tells you, I think, that there is a desire for more technical education, quality technical education, and there's some opportunities, I think, to rethink that balance and to make sure that young people don't end up with a degree that has cost them a lot of money but doesn't do what they hoped in terms of their earnings. And on charities, I think this is crucial. I think I was obviously very pleased to see them included in the energy help for businesses. They're absolutely crucial. Obviously, another thing to think through as well as that is the link across to my old department in DLUC and the housing budget and so on. So there's a lot to do there, and we must be careful that you are a force multiplier at the very least for everything that the government does. You're much more than that, obviously, but we must be careful we look after all the good work that you are doing, which takes the burden off the state.
Any quick
Just
points
very
on-
quickly on technology, I don't disagree at all. I think in the future, I think we're just at the beginnings of seeing what technology can do to support people as they get older. At the moment, and for the foreseeable future, it's about people and relationships. But technology, I think, will play a bigger and bigger part. And there are lots of older people who are digitally literate and who are able to use kit and want to. Unfortunately, there are an awful lot who aren't. So I think we just need to kind of be sort of sensible about it and offer both, and then we'll get the best of both worlds with his luck.
Yeah, so just on the digital health piece, so we actually evaluated very early doors GP at hand, which was one of the first forays in the health service and GP appointments digitally. And from then on, and then we had the pandemic, and we saw a huge rise in the proportion of digital appointments taking place. However, it isn't for everybody. It's a really useful mechanism, and it will rise as a useful mechanism, but it isn't for everybody. And one of the segmentation analysis pieces that we did for the Centre for Ageing Better looked at categorising older people by both financial means as well as connectedness. And there are still sizable proportions who are not connected, and as a result of that need an alternative channel. Top answer that older people want, though, from the improvements to the health service, being able to get a GP appointment on demand, as opposed to younger people who want improvement in the waiting list. So there are real differences there. Digital health can help, but it isn't the golden bullet to everything. And then just on the incentives problem, what can be done to help encourage younger people so that there are policy outcomes that everyone agrees with? Wow.
Yeah.
If you can answer that question, you'll be a better man than me, because actually what the real challenge faced is about communicating what policy outcomes are going to be delivered for which groups of society, and that's where we've seen, certainly in the last couple of weeks, a real failure in communication can impact on how messages land. And so it's not that every single policy needs to target certain groups. It's just you need to be clear about who, for what, for whom, what's the benefit. And actually, young people on things like the pension triple lock, there are differences between old and young, quite stark in how they feel about that. And young people are worried about fairness. But when it comes down to, okay, it isn't 100% fair, do you want to take it away from older people? Actually, that proportion falls back. So it's communication is really critical.
Thanks. Let's do a quick final round and then final words from everybody up here. The guy over there who was about to deliver his important point.
John Perriman, Carers UK. Minister, delighted, firstly, that you recognise the huge value of care that's being provided by family and friends. At Carers UK, we estimate that that's coming up to nearly £500 billion worth of care since the beginning of the pandemic, which has obviously undoubtedly supported our health and care systems, kept them afloat. Over 2 million unpaid carers are over 65. and nearly 500,000 are over 80. I just wondered what thoughts the panel had on what additional support should be provided to those carers to ensure that they are able to continue to look after their family and friends.
Great. But back to the middle here, gentleman at the back, and then lady in the glasses.
Oh yes, I'm Alok from Watford constituency. I really have a problem with the whole of the care system in the way that it's organised because, I'm now retired and the people I look after are even older than me. So my mother and my uncle and aunt is a case in point. Now, we believe in keeping our elderly at home, and we expect some help from the council and social service in particular. But they were not only helpful, but they were not helpful, but they were actually against us. They actually took us to court, but they lost. But that's another issue. I won't go into that. But the point is that we were using my uncle and aunt had dementia. We were actually using technology, cameras, voice-activated alarms, all sorts of things. But the social services didn't understand any of that. We even had RCDs to protect them from electric shocks, all sorts of things. And they wanted to take them into a home, which will add to resources, etc. And also getting help like filling in, the attendance allowance. We had to go to Age UK to get help because we couldn't, 75 pages to fill in. So can we simplify, and what help can we provide the elderly who are all looking after people who are even old? And they cannot handle all the stress that social services put on them. To me, it was a day in the office, but for a lot of people, it wouldn't be.
Good, interesting point, lady there, and and then.
Thank you. I'm Iona Parker from Braintree District Council. I'd just be interested to know whether there's quite a dividing line between how young men think and how young women think in electoral terms. Thank you.
And perhaps final one, lady in orange.
Thank you. Teresa Heritage, a county councillor from Hertfordshire. Recognise a lot that the Minister has been saying. In relation to the relationship between the NHS and local government, effectively, the local government has become the poor partner. It's looking for handouts, and there has to be a lot more sharing of resources. So I think that's a real issue about making sure that social care has enough money, as the gentleman said, to do what it needs to do. I know that the new care partnerships, the ICSs, etc., whatever they are in the country, might make a difference. But I've been doing this for nearly 20 years, and nothing ever changes. So it's about recognising that people in the health sector don't know everything, and that they need to work more across the piece with local government, which is actually the final place that people go and potentially trust. Also on primary care, I think there's a lot of confusion. Everybody thinks their GP is the NHS. Well, yes, they are, but they're not. So nobody really understands that. And the situation with getting appointments at the moment, no matter what age, is absolutely ridiculous. To be told by a receptionist, or asked me personally, well, what's the matter with you? And I'm thinking, why should I tell you? I think that's a real issue, and I think if you can sort that out, that might help a bit and give older and younger people, disabled people, and those with mental health problems a lot more confidence.
Thanks. Okay. I'm afraid I think we've got to draw that questions to a close now. So final thoughts from the panellists. I think that's a very interesting point raised by the gentleman at the back. I mean, whether we can, as it were, learn from South Asian traditions and make it easier for people to continue to care for their elderly relatives at home, granny flat subsidies and things like that. Anyway, I'll hold you to the end. You go next, and then Caroline.
Yeah, sure. So just on Alok's point, the key thing that resonated for me was about, it's not just about patients being digitally literate, it's about the workforce being digitally literate as well. And so there's clearly some work to do there. On the young men the men versus women, it follows the same sort of age divide trajectory. Age is more dominant, and you see exactly the same young women and young men much more likely to vote Labour and older women and older men more likely to vote Conservative. There are slightly more women in the categories than men. But I think overall the gender just follows the age divide because it's the more dominant, but it's exactly the same. And I think one thing just on that, different things matter to women when we ask about key issues facing the UK and we ask for an unprompted response. Women are more likely to flag issues like the environment, the health sector, the education sector, whilst they care about cost of living and the economy, because everybody does at the minute, but men are much more likely to be dominant on things like the economy. So you do see differences.
Thanks, Kelly. Final
Yeah,
word from
I'll
Caroline?
just pick up the support for carers point. We're in the wrong place, I think, on this at the moment as a country, because on the one hand, our sort of state formal services for social care aren't great, but then we don't really support informal care very well either. So we're kind of having our cake and eat it, if you like, from a state point of view. And I think inevitably it's going to take more money to do that. I mean, the amount that carers get if they're out of the labour market for caring is disgraceful and absolutely needs to change. Obviously, we're not in a place where we're about to be spending loads more money on stuff like that. So here's a sort of bit of optimism for something that actually doesn't cost very much money, or possibly no money at all for the government, and would really make a difference to all these issues, and that's flexible working. What would really help older carers and younger carers too is to be able to stay in the labour market, work part-time. Flexible working really helps. What would really help keep more people in the NHS, nurses particularly, absolute revolution in flexible working, and to a degree the same, flexible working on workers' terms rather than zero-sum contracts they don't want for care workers. So yes, I mean, please press ahead with flexible working. It would really make a difference.
Thanks. Final word, Neil?
These are really good points to end on. The reality or otherwise of integration, I absolutely take your point that it's easy to have the formality of it and not have the real impact. And then to really end on the point about uncared carers, I didn't have the figure, but you did have the figure of 2 trillion, the huge benefit of all that unpaid care. And the core point really, that if we could make this a bit easier, we could get more people what they want and the life that they want and get away from 75 pages of questions and bureaucracy. So there's a huge agenda there. This is really, from my point of view, supposed to be the start of a conversation, not the end. I'm easy to get hold of if you want to email me. I'm on neil.o'brien.mp@parliament.uk. Please do get in touch. There's huge expertise in this room. I'm really grateful for Policy Change for bringing together this rather brilliant event.
Well, thank you very much. And sorry it's been a bit noisy, but actually it hasn't really been protesters. It's been noisy conference attenders who should be in fringe meetings or in the conference. No. But anyway, next time we'll move them along. Anyway, thanks very much. Thanks to the panellists. And thanks for coming. Thank you.